Well, the United States remains Israel's closest ally. The Biden administration still refuses to condemn Israel's bombardment of Gaza. Speaking earlier on Friday, the White House press secretary said Washington does not consider Israel's response a significant overreaction to Palestinian rocket attacks.
Israel has the right to self-defense. Our focus remains on continuing to use every lever at our disposal to de-escalate the situation on the ground. I think it's also important to remind people Hamas is a terrorist organization. Hamas does not represent the views, the families, the people who are suffering, all of the Palestinian people who are suffering as a result of this violence. But there's no justification for 1,500 rockets coming from Hamas.
Joining me now, Zainab Chaudry from Washington, D.C. She is the spokeswoman and Maryland director for the Council on American-Islamic Relations. Zainab, good to have you on the show. When you hear statements like that from the top of the U.S. administration, like Israel has the right to self-defense, while no reference being made to the same rights for the Palestinians, what do you say?
You know, it conveys a level of tone deafness that unfortunately we have become very accustomed to here in the United States. Unfortunately, even in progressive circles, oftentimes many politicians who claim to be progressive oftentimes are progressive, except when it comes to Palestine. And this historic framing is always about prioritizing Israel's security while largely ignoring the impact of the illegal occupation, the decades-long illegal military occupation of Palestine. So this is another example and a reminder of the necessity to hold our elected officials accountable, to make sure that the Biden administration is taking into account the impact of this occupation, and also taking into account the very important context of the sequence of events that are leading up to the rockets that are being fired. Not saying that we are in any way supporting any kind of violence on either side, but the fact that there is there's a sequence of events that leads up to that, including the the military soldiers who invaded Al-Aqsa, the brutalizing dehumanization of Palestinians in Jerusalem, in the West Bank. This is just, one example of how we need to make sure that the Biden administration is telling the full story, not just one part of it that is politically expedient.
Okay. You mentioned some progressive lawmakers, so I do want to ask you. I mean, some are out there speaking out against the actions of the Israeli military. Do you feel that there is a shift from the tone and the language of the past?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is something that's actually the silver lining on the cloud of this entire issue that, many members of our communities are assessing very closely. The fact that there are many more members of Congress, for example, who are speaking out, who are publicly, vehemently condemning the human rights violations that the Israeli government is perpetrating against Palestinians. And I think the fact that the Human Rights Watch's recent report that accuses the Israeli government of committing crimes of apartheid and persecution against Palestinians helps to solidify and bolster that case. The fact that kind of reports are providing not just anecdotal evidence, but also data that indicates that there's been a long history of terrorizing Palestinian people, of stripping them of their dignity, dehumanization that occurs on a daily basis, a system of apartheid, for example, that has two separate legal systems for Arabs and Israeli Jews in their cities, is just a clear indication that there is a system of apartheid that is in place. And this is helping to compel, I think, members of the public, also members of Congress, to more publicly denounce Israel's crimes against humanity and to call for justice.
Talk to us about your community, because your organization, CAIR, has condemned a House resolution that sort of backs Israel's oppression of Palestinians. But what role do you feel that organizations like CAIR should be playing as we move forward?
So one of the really key critical points is to make sure that we are holding media, for example, accountable in how these stories are being told. For example, oftentimes whenever there's escalation in violence, it's referred to as clashes within the media, when we know that there's a very clear imbalance of power. So we're also calling on journalists and media outlets to make sure that they're framing the story in a balanced way. So we're holding media accountable accountable. And we're also working to make sure that legislation, including Congresswoman Betty McCollum's House resolution, HR 2590, is something that members of Congress will support and they will pass. This is defending the human rights of Palestinian children and families living under Israeli military occupation act. We're also encouraging community members to be visible and to be mobilized, to be in public spaces, to attend demonstrations, to raise awareness about the plight of the Palestinian people, especially those who have historically been silenced, whose stories have not been told. We're calling on the Biden administration to drop its pledge to not publicly criticize the state of Israel and instead support the rule of law and human rights by making it clear to Israel that evicting families in East Jerusalem violates international law. It is a crime, and it's not something that our government should be using $3.4 billion annually of our tax dollars to help fund this illegal occupation that is terrorizing and killing so many innocent people. So there's many different components to the strategy in terms of advocating and lobbying and making sure that our elected officials are being held accountable. And organizations like ours are also working with the public to raise awareness, and we're encouraging people to speak out.